Pretty cool, huh? We can finally see our pattern start to emerge here. So the next step is to glue all these pieces together. And there's a few methods that you can use, and I'll explain them to you, and you decide what works best for you. First method is to take a straight flat board. MDF is my choice for this, and let's pretend that the bench is the MDF for now, and these pieces are sitting on top of it. What you would do is take another piece of MDF, and of course this is just an example, but you would screw this down to the MDF below it. Okay, this is basically your straight edge, your ledger, and you would take a second piece, and this one is going to float. And once you get all the glue on the surfaces, you will bring this one up tight. You will use a couple of bar clamps all along the way to make sure that they stay in line, and then you'll put a pipe clamp, a long pipe clamp, over this entire thing, and that will pull all your joints together. Now, I've done it that way and it works, but you have a lot of glue surface that you have to apply glue to, and you're racing the clock here. So it's pretty stressful to try and get all that put on, get all the clamps on, and more importantly to get every one of these joints exactly perfect. If it's not perfect, then it really defeats the purpose of our featuring. Remember, this is going to be the focus of the bowl, so if it's not right, people are immediately going to notice it. So the way that I like to do it is I like to break it up in groups of twos, and again, using a bar clamp, I simply apply the glue, and one piece at a time I can adjust the pattern until it's exactly right, tighten it down, and wait a few hours. I prefer to use the bar clamps like this. They have a nice wide pad, so I get a good dispersion of pressure here, as opposed to, say, a C-clamp where it has a very narrow pad here. You really run the risk of indenting the wood, and of course you could cut cawls, but there's something else that you have to cut, something else you have to get on there, and also get lined up, as well as get your pattern lined up. So it's a lot of extra work, and if you don't have enough bar clamps to do it all in one run, don't worry about it. Clamp as many as you have clamps available to do it with. It's not worth the risk of messing up the pattern just for the sake of time. We spend a lot of time on these bowls anyway, so what's an extra day or two of clamping and drying? So that's the way I'm going to do it, and I'll see you guys back in a few minutes after it's all dry. Well, it's a new day and the glue's had time to dry. So we're to the point where we're fixing to cut our miter joints on either side to form our circle. Problem is, in the shape that these are in right now, they're pretty difficult to hold safely and securely. So what we want to do is true them up a little bit, and we want to be left with this rectangular shape right here. The top and these 2 points at the bottom are waste from here on out. There's no point in keeping them. So if we could cut that off, it would make holding this piece a lot safer, and that safety, as well as the straight edge that we're left with, is really going to improve our accuracy of our cuts. So the question is, how do we get rid of the excess material? Now, if you were to take it over to, say, the miter box, the piece is longer than it is wider, and it's also very small. So trying to cut that there would not be a good option. Of course, you could build some form of a jig to hold it, but that's something else you have to build. Plus, it's kind of a specialized one-time use item. So, there's better methods out there. And the method that I prefer to use is the table saw. And of course, the piece, again, in its current state, is far too small to use on the table saw. But if we were to take all the pieces and glue them back together into one continuous line, now we can run it through on either side, cutting off the waste, and we're left with one continuous rectangle. The problem is, what we would then have to do is cut it back apart at each other intersection. So basically this intersection, this one, and continue on. Now, that would be removing a little bit of material from either side, and honestly, it's probably not even enough to notice, but there is another alternative. And what I do here is I apply glue to both sides, and I take just a standard piece of newspaper and put in there, and I glue it back together again. Now what that allows us to do is it holds very securely. You'd be very surprised. And so we can make our cuts, and when it's all said and done, what we can do is just snap it and it will break right apart, basically right exactly on that joint. And then we're left with our rectangles, which we can take to our miter sled and make our cuts. So that's what I'm going to get started on, and I'll meet you guys back in a few minutes when I have the entire length glued up and ready to cut. Now, just as before, when I glued up all the pieces in pairs, I'm repeating that process again, and I'm gluing each pair to another pair, making groups of 4, and then I'll make groups of 8 and continue on. And the reason I'm doing that, again, is basically for accuracy. And what we have to do is make sure that our stripe there matches up, absolutely perfectly. It's a little difficult to do with the newspaper in there, but we want to make sure that's absolutely straight. If we do not, and one piece is shifted past the other, when we run it on the table saw, it's going to remove more material from one side as opposed to the other, and therefore it'll ultimately throw our pattern off. So by breaking it up into smaller groups yet again, we'll get a better result in the end. So when these are dry, I'll continue on to groups of 8, and eventually we'll have our entire line. Well, after several rounds of gluing, we finally have our completed piece. So what I want to do now is I want to run a very, very light pass through the planer. Rather than put the piece through as is, because we essentially built in weak joints every other joint, what we need to do is put it on some form of a backer. So I'm just using a piece of 1x4, and I've hot glued it, kind of alternating either side all the way down, and that'll stiffen it up. And again, I'm taking a very, very light pass. I just want to get it level. One other thing you might want to think about, the pieces are not running, the grain is not running the perpendicular basically to the blades, they're running slightly askew. So what happens is you may get some tear out here. Now that doesn't bother me because we are ultimately going to turn this piece anyway, so if I do get some tear out, it's no big deal. This is not like it's going to be a finished surface, not yet anyway. So we're going to make some light cuts, and then we're going to go to the table saw and trim it up. Now, in one pass of the planer completed, I carefully cut through the glue that was holding the segments down, and I flipped the piece over. Now, this go around, what I want to do is make sure that I line up our strip of zigzag pattern here with the edge of the 1x4, and I just simply put it up against the fence, made sure both were tight, and then hot glued along that edge. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it through the planer again, very light passes, just want to get it flat, and then when we run it through the table saw, we're going to run it on this board again. This is basically just for some added safety. Remember, we intentionally put in some weak joints. So what I don't want to happen is the blade basically to kick them up and break them, or when we get to the end, I don't want it to essentially just snap off and fall into the floor that way either. So by running it on the board, we'll true up one edge, we'll flip the thing around, true up the other edge, and then we can get it off and start cutting our miters to form our rings. So back to the plate. So here we have our completed zigzag pattern in a rectangular form, which makes it a little bit easier to cut our segments. So that's what we're fixing to do, but first we need to make sure that this is going to break apart like I promised. Hopefully it won't make a liar out of me. So let's see what happens. Yep, and just like I said, breaks apart right there on those seams. So I'm going to finish breaking the rest of them apart, and we're going to set up our sled, and we're going to start cutting our miters.